Hello everybody and welcome. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet tonight and pay my respects to elders both past and present. I'd also like to welcome our industry colleagues, student and staff who are here tonight. This is one of our Cities at UNSW events, and tonight we are co-hosting it with the Council for Tall Buildings and Urban Habitat, New South Wales chapter, of which I'm a member, along with my colleague Phil Oldfield from UNSW, and many of our members are here tonight. But I'd like to also thank our sponsors for tonight's event, Ethos Urban, who is our event sponsor, and also Lend-Lease, who is our annual event sponsor. So thank you to both of our major sponsors for that. The CTBUH chapter has been hosting design excellence events for the past 5 years, showcasing all the entries from design competitions. And it's timely, therefore, that we have an event to discuss the first comprehensive analysis of the City of Sydney design excellence competitions by UNSW Professor Robert Freestone, who undertook this research with Dr. Gethin Davison and Richard Hugh. We'll hear from Rob, who will provide an overview of the research findings and share his insights published in their new book, Designing the Global City. This will be followed by a panel discussion with senior industry professionals on their views and experiences of the design excellence competition process. As you know, in the past 20 years, Sydney has undergone an incredible transformation, and one of the key initiatives that has shaped our city's skyline over the past 2 decades was the introduction of these design excellence competitions that has brought into fruition a wave of new buildings that demonstrate design excellence. It's a really unique process, as many of you would know, that there are many examples of design competitions globally, but Sydney is the only jurisdiction where competitions are mandated for major private development and are part of the approval system. So what did the research reveal? Rob will summarise his findings of this multi-year research project into the effectiveness of competitive processes and provide background reviews that ultimately point out to the value-adding benefit of this process, and one that significantly strikes a balance between the public and private interests. So I'd like to introduce Rob Freestone to you who don't know him. He is an internationally recognised for his urban research and teaching and has influenced understandings of the built environment worldwide. His work has also prompted national research and policy interest in urban planning challenges and legacies, helping to integrate Australian perspectives into world debates. His expertise in urban policy is focused on the development of planning, theory, and practice, in particular regional and metropolitan visions, heritage and conservation, infrastructure provision, and urban design. His work is synonymous with the overarching mission of our faculty, the UNSW Faculty of Built Environment, to create sustainable, livable, and productive cities. So please join me in welcoming Professor Robert Freestone.
Well, thank you, Helen. Thank you to CTBUH, Lend-Lease and Ethos Urban. Thank you all for coming here this evening as well. There are people in this auditorium who will know the process pretty well, its ins and outs, and there are others of you who won't know that much about it at all, and I was in that camp a couple of years ago as well. So in terms of pitching my presentation tonight, I'm going to try and go between those two ends of the spectrum and not assume that everyone here is a practicing architect engaged in this day to day. So let me go straight to the book, which comes out of a 2-year Australian Research Council discovery project, and we did lots of things along the way in researching this. We crunched some numbers, we did a lot of historical digging, we searched out what documentation we could find. We were given the privilege of sitting in on 2 actual competition processes, but the core of it is talking to 60 odd observers and participants and practitioners and gathering their wisdom. We report them anonymously in the book, following ethical protocols, but Chapter 1 lists them all by name, and their input has been valuable. I'm talking we here occasionally, so this is not just me, it's my co-authors Gethin Davison from UNSW and Richard Hugh from University of Canberra. We had some research assistants along the way, and Sarah Baker, who was at the project face from the beginning and almost to the end, played a critical role, and even had a kind of informal secondment at the City Council for a few months as well. We had an advisory panel that was invaluable. John Punter from University of Cardiff, Ken Marr from Hassel, Alex Zahns from his own eponymous practice and a former dean here, and Graham Jahn as Director of Sydney City Development and Transport. And Graham and his team's support were critical for this project to succeed. I think we wore out our welcome perhaps near the end. But we absolve Graham and his team and everyone else I've sort of name-checked there for the findings and the conclusions that we reach in this project, because they were ours alone. Some of you might have seen this film, The Competition. It's about procuring a design for the new National Art Museum of Andorra, and it tracks several high-profile architects in that process: Frank Gehry, Jean Nouvel, Dominique Perrault and Zaha Hadid. And it's a nice kind of insight into sort of the culture of the competition, the rituals, the starchitects, the dramas, the traumas, interactions between jury and competitors. This is not Dr. Evil out of a Austin Powers movie. It's actually Jean Nouvel, one of the stars, and his comment here kind of captures what's sort of at the heart of this film and the competitive process, the mystery of depth. My spoiler alert is to tonight tell you I'm not going to tell you what happens in this documentary, but I'm not going to deeply get into the mystery of depth tonight. I'm going to take, in the interest of the mixed audience here, a kind of a broad-ranging critical review from afar. Academically, I think I'm obliged to say something about how we frame this work in terms of broader intellectual and policy ideas. And we ended up with three sort of major dimensions. One, globalisation, which is really dominated by economics, and in particular economic competitiveness. And in that literature, there's not a great deal dealing with design per se. And so we felt that was a gap. Design excellence itself has not attracted a significant research literature at all since it sort of comes onto the scene in the early 1990s. The second thread deals with public policy, and all three chief investigators on this project were sort of situated in a planning and policy realm rather than in an architecture area. So we kind of veered towards social science, and Jonathan Barnett's classic book from the 1970s, Urban Design as Public Policy, gave us a bit of a guide there. And in turn, that sort of led to us focusing on a particular theme of that book, and that is this sort of balance between public and private interest. And then the third area was the design governance paradigm, which Matthew Carmona from UCL talked about in a Cities at UNSW lecture earlier this year. And this deals with the sort of the institutional, the procedural, the evaluative aspects of design, and looking at the efficacy of various tools, both formal and informal, which is how he classifies design competitions. And so design competitions in this sort of hierarchy bobs up as a particular focus for us in a study that was originally going to look far more broadly at sort of planning and development in the CBD. And here Jack Nasser's book is a well-known text in the field, a very expansive title, but ultimately just dealing with one institutional building in the United States. So we thought our project here had some novelty because it was stitching together these three big themes relevant to both policy and kind of academic research. And at the same time, it wasn't just dealing with one competition, which is what dominates the literature, particularly the architectural literature, but it was going to deal with a suite of competitions under one sponsor and over the best part of 2 decades. Locally, a project that led the way from away from the global to the local was this work, A History of Post-War Design in Sydney. And this ends, as you can see in that date line, just at the time when the design excellence process gets going. So one of the aims of our project was to ask the question, well, what happened next? And it also gave us an opportunity to revisit the history that was sketched out by John Punter in this work. And we identified 3 particular factors that together sort of led the way for the innovation that we see from the City Council around the turn of the century. One was the wider predisposition to design and design quality that we see emerging from the from the 1980s onwards. A second was a prehistory of design competitions as a suitable methodology for securing excellence. So this tradition primarily rested with public buildings, think the Opera House, but there were other private competitions as well, including some big ones in the 1980s, 1990s. The first Government House Museum site on the screen at the moment, even East Circular Quay. So one of the concerns that had sort of come out of city building during this process was the fact that some big architectural practices tended to sort of dominate commissions, a kind of oligopoly of design. And the critics were saying that sort of lacked the sort of creative tension that could really produce the best results. And then the third sort of prehistoric thread, if you like, that set the scene for design excellence was the evolution to sort of better government at the City Council, sort of leaving aside the machine party politics that had dominated the council for much of its history, getting independence in office and moving towards a more progressive and enlightened approach to governance. And the Living City strategy in 1994 kind of brings together many of the themes at that time. This is an initiative of Frank Sartor, the mayor at the time, who you might remember during the 2000 Olympics almost transitions to be the metropolitan mayor of Sydney. But certainly during that time gets to appreciate, design, globalism, the world stage. And I think if anyone is probably the godfather of what I'm talking about tonight, it's Frank Sartor. I'm not going to tediously summarise the book. You get a chance to buy a copy later if you want. And I should add that under the academic contract that we sign, and such is the state of academic publishing, that we get no royalties. So you're not lining the pockets of the authors when you do that. What I want to do is concentrate on a few more select themes, and I'll start with some qualifications. So we're focused here just on the central business district, the CBD, roughly the north-south spine leading from Circular Quay to around Central Railway Station, with Darling Harbour to the west and the parklands to the east. And excluding all those sites that are under state government control, such as Barangaroo. So while some of the themes and issues I talk about tonight will be transferable, I think, to other jurisdictions, we need to be aware of the particular culture and specificity of this place environmental terms, in institutional terms, in broader historical terms, and the challenges that that has posed for planning. The Council's competition policies were extended in 2012 to outside the CBD, but I'm not going to go there tonight. Maybe that's a scenario for some future research. And the related caveat to that is that I'm dealing with our study zone, which is 2000 to 2017. Second qualification is the need to see the competitive regime within a broader context of a quite complex planning system. There can be a bubble effect in just focusing on the competition itself, but it sits inside many other processes, the whole development approval system, and many of those things kick in significant influences that affect the design outcome as well. And thirdly, the design excellence philosophy of the Council is not just about these competitions. It pervades so much of its activity in the approval and design and project process. So the design excellence provisions, diffuse through the local planning instrument, and I've highlighted some of the kind of key targets here in blue. And related to this, of course, design excellence in City Council's terms also refers to the broader public domain as well. But it's the competitive design policy, or the CDP, as it applies to buildings, which I'm talking about tonight. And there are various triggers for when this policy comes into play in terms of the height of buildings, their site area, and the capital investment that they represent. I want to say a little bit more about the incentives on floor space and height that are on offer for developers, because these are there primarily as a way of helping the developer who has to pay all the costs of the competition, the jurors and the architects and the specialist consultants, as a way of defraying some of those out-of-pocket costs. So there is a kind of a baseline floor space ratio within the central city. I'm not going to get technical here. There are ways of bumping that up through purchasing of heritage floor space, but here the design excellence is sort of the cream on top. More floor space if there's not any negative amenity impacts on the surrounding city in terms of wind or solar access or overshadowing and so on. So the city has used these floor space incentives really since the 1960s, accelerating in the 1970s with the City of Sydney Strategic Plan, which was an important document that really introduces urban design values in a big way into the city. So design excellence is really the latest version of that. And secondly, there's a height incentive, again, provided that there are no negative collateral impacts as well. So in both instances, floor space and height, depending on the quality of the project and some of the other planning constraints that can click in, not all successful competition winners get their full 10%. There are different types of competitive process as well. I'm referring to them this evening all as competitions. The competitive design alternative process is a more sort of developer-friendly model. You can see that by the number of firms that might be invited in and how the selection panel is decided upon. These competitions now are all a well-oiled machine, well-managed, very professional, and they've kind of opened up a new market for some of the big planning practices, indeed like our sponsor tonight. And the council is a presence throughout these. The flow chart for the design process is rather complex, and we don't have time to kind of go into this, and I thank Graham and his team for putting together this image for me. The easiest way to see this competitive process is it's kind of in between the council's sort of two-stage development application timetable. Stage one of that process is to kind of get a development control or a master plan that carries with it information about the general height and bulk and orientation of a new development, and then a stage two, which is a much more detailed development application. So the competitive process kind of links these two, interprets the various design constraints on the site, but at the same time doesn't go as far as a detailed application will deliver. There are guidelines and expectations all along the design competition brief, which the developer prepares with input from the council, is the critical document. There's advice available to the competitors as well from expert consultants that the developer will bring in, but the competitors don't see or hear anything of each other. They're in their own little silos, even when it comes to the presentation. And the presentation is, again, another private process. Here, the architects get to go to Jean Nouvel's Mystery of the Depth in terms of the creative spark that informs their solution for what are increasingly complex sites. But at the same time, the bulk of the discussion amongst the jurors and the architects presenting, either individually or as a small team, tends to be about more pragmatic matters, about treatment of the facades or access and egress, vertical circulation, the interior layouts, connection to the public realm beyond as well. The jury eventually makes its determination and writes a report. These reports are not public documents in the conventional sense of the term, and frustratingly we were not able to read many of them at all, but some of them bob up on the internet conveniently. Metrics and maps. I just wanted to capture the sort of scale of this phenomenon I'm talking about, and I'm about halfway. Summary graphics of the impacts between 2000 and 2017. So that 46 projects includes the 26 that were actually completed and inhabited by tenants. The capital value here, over $7 billion, is really a back of the envelope calculation. It's probably underestimating the contribution of these to the Sydney economy. And I'll tease out some of the numbers about competitors in a moment. In geographic terms, the sites are all across the city, and you can see that there's some sort of large red and green blobs here as well. In terms of time, it's useful to think about sort of two stages here. One pre the global financial crisis, GFC, and one after it. And things also change in 2012. There are new rules for competition policies, and the investment value was doubled from $50 million projects to $100 million projects. So these two stages here are also important for understanding the design outcomes as well. In terms of land use, mixed developments predominate, a third of all those 46 projects, equally divided between residential and commercial. It's probably the trends that are more interesting than that static breakdown. You can see here that residential and hotel service apartment developments on the up through the second stage after 2012. Down is commercial during those years. something that has concerned the City Council through the loss of sort of job-generating floor space. And also across these two phases, we see other things happening. The buildings are getting taller, getting more expensive. They're shifting from sort of infill projects to building replacements. And the time it takes them to get an approval is also increasing. And so my last slide of numbers just gives you something of the magnitude of the process. I said there were 3 types of processes, so there's not too many open competitions, and developers have preferred clearly that option that gives them a little bit more kind of input into the process. There have been nearly 90 competing architectural firms, 52 winning firms. That's more than the 46 projects, and that's because some of them have combined to create sort of consortia. 11 wins by international firms. That's only about 20% of the total projects. And we don't have full data on the juror numbers, but there's quite a big cast that's been involved there as well. So we were interested in design outcomes. We didn't revisit the jury decisions. We just went out and had a look at what was there on the ground. This was inevitably a subjective process, but we developed a rating checklist to help us get some order and discipline into our evaluations. And here's that methodology in evolution towards something that became a little bit more disaggregated, to look at issues of crime mitigation, a wide range of things, legibility, pedestrian activity, shelter, comfort, land use mix, and so on. So I'm not going to go through this row by row, but just again make some selective observations. So here are some early outcomes pre-2011. And the X here means that we're not looking at the competitive entry, it's the buildings behind that are of interest. And when we look at some of these projects now, they, to our eyes, they didn't look all that remarkable. On the right, you've got a sort of an infill around a heritage building, probably a pub on the corner, and there's quite a few of those in the early days. And on the left-hand side, you know, you've got sort of stacks on the mill. You know, the critical would say, how many design competitions does it take to create a good urban design outcome? But I think things do demonstrably improve. The whole refurbishment of the Hilton Hotel sort of transformed one of the sort of black spots of design in Central City that was always coming up in newspapers and architecture ratings as one of the ugliest buildings in the city. Comparing before and after shots is a sort of a useful device to see what impact has been made. This is at the southern end of Hyde Park. This is the corner of Bent and O'Connell Street, a 29-storey commercial tower. We write a fuller assessment of this in our book, but clearly the conclusion for tonight is that it's a significant improvement on what was there before. And similarly, 333 George Street, which ended up being the sort of last of the 2017 projects that we looked at. So what all 3 of those projects tell you is the design competitive process in part has helped clean the city out of some rather dull and desultory mid-1960s buildings and replace them with structures that are far more refined and sophisticated and sustainable and make a much more emphatic and welcome gesture to the public realm, which is enhanced along the way with so many of these projects actually and projected, as we see there bottom left. And this tends to mean genuine public space, not sort of residual, privately owned but public managed space. And we're talking here about community facilities, pedestrian shelter, laneway activation, heritage conservation, public art, significant placemaking contributions. In the book, we single out 3 impressive developments and the processes they went through for more intense scrutiny, and all are premium global city projects. And in this high end with, top architects and well-heeled and visionary developers, this is where the design process has certainly worked out pretty well. So the EY Tower, the first of what is going to be almost a complete makeover of a whole city block by competitively designed buildings, but set within a cohesive master plan. 60 Martin Place, now well under construction, with that dramatic but sort of respectful cantilever over St Stephen's Church. The Quay Quarter, an iconic tower by an international architect that's been partnered with a sort of a low-rise infill revitalisation quarter by local architects. So that's an insight into design quality, and just looking at some of the awards that these projects have won is another indicator that something good seems to be happening here. So this is the last part of my talk, or the penultimate part of my talk before I conclude. We talk to a lot of people, as I said, architects, planners, academics, city councillors, planning managers. Many of these people have had multiple roles in this process, and we wanted to know what they felt was good about it and what might be improved. And we tried to corroborate that information through looking at other sources. All of these conversations were great. We had to stop because we ran out of time and money. We only had one person who proved reluctant to talk to us, and we only had a second person who decided they shouldn't have talked to us. And so their input was kind of scrubbed from the final book. We ended up with several 100,000 words of transcripts. We've only been able, in a sense, really to, extract some of the key things from that. And so let me take you through some of the concerns, and a variety were expressed to us. Were there other pathways to design excellence? An issue that might come up with the panel. Were there too many international architects involved and not enough locals? Could more social criteria be injected into the evaluation process? What did the jury want? Did they want us to break some of the rules for a really creative solution, or did we just really have to stick with those planning constraints? The 5 that were most expressed to us, and we could find some grounds for seeing evidence for, was increased costs and red tape and approval times for developers. There's a counter side to all of these in terms of the value add that ultimately gets added to a project, but some developers were concerned. Insufficient remuneration for architects, and indeed some of the consultants who might be brought in by architects to help in the competitive design process. This was sort of contrasted with the incentives that developers get of 10% floor space, which can mean multi-million dollars in the Sydney market. The view was expressed that increasingly architects have to deliver more and more detailed work in these competitions, and that seemed to be a bit unfair to some as well. Some architects expressed a concern that the competitions, because they're curated individually through individual contributions, meant that it was difficult to get quality one-on-one time with a client, but that's kind of precisely the rationale for this procedure, to kind of break the cosy relationships that were there in the 80s and the 90s. There were questions about how architects and jurors were actually selected. There was concern the design alternatives model was a little more sort of favourable to developers, and perhaps it should be. And there were comments about the lack of public gaze into this process, which is basically behind closed doors. And we heard all the reasons for that: commerciality, in confidence, protection of intellectual property of architects, concern from developers that if this got out, you know, there'd be a big sort of public controversy about which was the best design. Particularly embarrassing if the public's best design was not the developer's best choice, and so on. But nevertheless, we felt really that maybe something was going missing in this. This very crucial part of how the city is being rebuilt could have perhaps slightly more visibility, either in the early stage where some of the entries are put on public show, or certainly in the second stage development application where a more fulsome account of the process could be written, and that appears in many of the statements that we looked at. There are egos at work here. I mean, Norman Foster, who featured in the competition, actually pulled out of that when he discovered that there was going to be a camera team sort of following him around the process. So he only makes a brief appearance on screen, and Foster's company has won 2 of the 46 competitions that were held here in Sydney up to 2017. But he makes this comment about competitions are only as good as they're run. And, you know, that is a conclusion that is often heard. And one of the things that sort of threads through our book is not just about the Sydney case, but what we can learn more generally about this process. But certainly on the Sydney model, you know, we came away impressed by how the jury process was run. But addressing some of the concerns just reported, we thought that there are insights there that might be useful if a review of the policy was considered to kind of catch up with how Sydney has changed since 2012. Some clearer criteria and rules in certain areas. I talked about 2 phases. You know, maybe we're almost at the point where a 3rd phase is upon us, and we uncovered, as reported in the book, some of the things that might go into consideration for that 3rd phase. But I don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater, because we also came away with a whole string of positives. And I'm aware my time is probably a little bit over, so I'll accelerate to my conclusion. There was clear consensus, almost unanimous amongst everyone we talked to, that here was something that had really raised the bar of urban design quality in Sydney since the 1990s. That it had closed the gap, which is a phrase that Graham Jahn used in his Utzon lecture here on campus 3 years ago. The gap between sort of public interest and private interest. Helen Lochhead referred to that in her introduction this evening. This process of bringing, you know, the designer, the developer, the regulator into a conversation, into a dialogue early on in the development chain, in a way that could only be valuable for the result down the end. And related to that, developers getting jiggy with the idea of the design dividend, the idea that spending a bit more can actually have good commercial returns. And long-term thinking sort of begins to take over, not just that short-term commercial project, which might have dominated some of the earlier generation of commercial buildings in the city. Certainly, if you remember some of those numbers I put up about the number of architects involved, 88 firms, that's smashing that kind of early oligopoly that we saw there in the 70s and the 80s in the Sydney, bringing in emerging architects, partnering between Australian and international architects, big firms and small firms. And finally, I think this whole kind of process in Sydney, hidden from the general public, but probably well known amongst the cognoscenti of the design professions, has certainly been, I think, an exemplar for rising interest and the diffusing of these same sort of mechanisms elsewhere, with other agencies coming involved. So other local councils have picked up on this, notably Parramatta. Other state government agencies have done likewise, and the New Look Government Architects Office is also out there sort of promoting design excellence and design competitions as well. So I'll wrap up there. I'm conscious that I'm only the warm-up act for the panel that follows. I hope that gives you a sensible overview of our book. It ended up being 300 pages, which was a bit of a shock. I haven't delved into Nouvel's mystery of the depth, but I hope I've given a satisfactory broad brush survey. Here is something that I think intersects with those three themes I talked about. We get an insight into kind of global Sydney and how it's being remade. We understand the crucial role of planning as an instrument for breaching public benefits and private gain. And we see how the competition can become a kind of a vital instrument of design governance. I was a bit brief with my history early on. This clearly didn't happen overnight, and it's happened in a particularly distinctive urban environment. And I think there are caveats that might be taken on board as these ideas diffuse elsewhere through Sydney and other cities. When I discuss, this is my last slide, when I discuss what was happening in Sydney with a bunch of New York City planners last year, they were aghast. They couldn't believe it. They didn't understand how a public local authority would have so much sway over effectively a private procurement and development process. And they said that if this was New York, there'd be lawsuits and litigation galore. Hasn't happened in Sydney at all. So I think what Frank Sartor and his team introduced all those years ago, it's just one element of a wider package of reform, has become a kind of a lasting and very interesting and valuating urban design regime. It doesn't make it sacrosanct, but it does, as Helen made mention of in her introduction, it has made for what appears to be a unique system anywhere in the world, and for that reason it seems to be worth nurturing and sticking with. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Rob. How many people have experience of the design excellence competitions? It'd be interesting to know how many people are students here tonight, and it's a new regime. No? Who are students? Who are students who have no? Oh, so okay. So most people I would think are familiar with this. But so what we thought we'd do is we would actually have a panel discussion from people who have participated in the process. I'd like to invite Graham Jahn, who's the Director of Planning and Development and Transport at the City of Sydney, to join us. Louise Mason, Group Executive and CEO of Commercial Property at Stockland and formerly of AMP Capital. Vivian, Architect and Director of Bates Smart Proprietary Limited, and also President of the Council of Tall Buildings and Urban Habitat in Australia. And Clare Swan, Planner and Director of Ethos Urban and Director of JBA Urban Development Services. So I am, I'm not really sure how many of you were interviewed for this book. Were you all interviewed for this book?
Yes.
Yep. Yes?
Yep.
Yes.
Yep.
So that's interesting too. I was too. And so I think we probably all have quite distinct and particular viewpoints. And probably, I think I'd like to start by sort of really picking up on the points that Rob made about global competitiveness, public policy and public interest, and design governance, because I think each of you can contribute to those points in various ways. But probably the first person I'd like to I might finish with Graham, but I probably might ask Louise, as a developer who's putting your money on the table. You're most significantly associated with the development of Quay Quarter, which is probably one of the biggest and high-profile competitions in town. And it is significant in the sense that it not only has a star architect, which is always a bit fractious in our local architectural economy, but also included a number of young and emerging practices. So I would like to ask you your experience of that, but also I'd also like to you to comment on the points that Rob made about the lack of client input in terms of how you were, one step removed. And a final point, which I would like to sort of ask is, in terms of competitiveness, how has this contributed to the competitiveness of the development? We know you're going to get an uplift, that translates to financial benefit, but what is the profile and reputational benefit that you gained from being involved in this design competition?
Okay. I've sat on 2 juries and been the proponent on 2 developments that went through the design competition. And I must say I was actually very, very surprised at how pragmatic, how much it was a partnership between the authorities and the proponent, and how both were working to get to a better end. So the piece for, say, Quay Quarter, where I was with my former employer, AMP Capital, between the city and AMP Capital, right from discussing who might be on the panel through to the actual days of the competition was very much a partnership. So between Graham and the development team in that case, which at the time was being led by Jeff Pearce, who's now at UNSW, together Graham and the team came up with 10 or 12 architectural firms, Australian and offshore, who might be approached, because not every architectural firm wants to participate, because it is a costly process. AMP Capital did pay, and it's been in the public realm, so I'm not giving things away, $250,000 per architect. So with 6 architects, that was $1.5 million paid. But it was 10 or 12 architects were approached. They were visited around the globe with a brief, and we got to the 6 that we decided would be on the panel. It was a really detailed approach. And sometimes when I hear investors or developers say, oh, we don't have much say, it's a one-sided process, I don't understand that. Sometimes it's been said to me, oh, yes, but you're acting on behalf of a big investor. To me, it's what the proponent puts into it and how they work with the authority that you do get the best outcome. So in the case of Quay Quarter, it was an amazingly detailed brief right from day one, to the firms that were approached, to the 6 who then participated, to the way it was assessed. So when those designs came in on the Thursday and Friday, the AMP Capital team worked throughout the weekend with valuers, with leasing agents, with engineers, with a whole raft of people to assess each of the 6 to say, can they even be built? If they're not feasible, then we can go through all the competitions in the world, but it won't eventuate. That was then reviewed within the business. It was discussed with council. And then as each person presented then on the Monday and Tuesday, it was over 2 days. At the end of that presentation, AMP Capital, as the client or proponent, stood up and talked through each of the elements of the brief to say whether it met it or not, was it doable or not. Now, the authority didn't have to take that into account, but what I found during the conversation, so there were 2 members of AMP Capital on that team. We also had Alex Jahn as one of our 3, and then there were 2 former government architects and Bridget Smythe from council on the jury. It was a very commercially relevant design relevant, public realm relevant discussion that happened when each of those firms left the room. So I'm a huge fan of it because I think it does lead to better outcomes, but there's a commercial reality around it as well. So I do struggle when people in my shoes say, oh, we've got to go through a design competition. I think there's enough examples, and Rob's been through them, of what you can get out of it. But you have to be really involved. And from the proponent side, you've got to have huge capability sitting in the team to deliver the brief, the review, and to work in partnership with the authority. Now, I can't remember some of the other parts of the question.
Well, the second part of the question was really about the value and reputation and profile part of it in terms of global competitiveness.
Yep.
And there were sort of three aspects of Rob's point. How does that play into your global competitiveness or even your Sydney competitiveness?
Well, when you looked at Quarter, it's a postcard shot of Sydney. You've got the bridge, you've got the Opera House, and you've got this building here. So it was always, it was a hugely important element for both the proponent and for the authority, I think, to get something that was going to enhance that postcard shot of Sydney. I think the firms we had, there was 1 local and 5 offshore, produced some amazing results. And I think having gone through a competition of that standard, and we were very public about what we were doing, and there was a lot of media post the competition around it, I think it enhanced the product. But what we also did as the proponent was make sure that product was commercially viable and leasable, etc. So you had the element of an incredible design, but in the case of that designer being 3XN, they have a very clear approach of designing from the inside out, designing from the workforce out, and creating very clean, floor plates, etc. So to me, there was a whole lot of wins in that for everyone. So I think it certainly enhanced the product and it enhanced the brand in relation to that building.
I might go to Philip and then you can sort of chime in, because there was the elements of procurement of architects and there is quite a lot of debate about Starchitects, and the numbers that Rob mentions don't bear out that in fact there are more Starchitects in town than there are local practitioners being supported. But in fact there is a tendency for the big end of town to get the big name architects and the smaller names and emerging architects to get less high profile projects spatially. Philip, as someone who's competed in a number of competitions, do you think it's a level playing field for Australian practices versus the international architects coming in?
Well, first of all, I think Sydney's a global city, so there are going to be international players, and I think the international architects have, I think, improved the level of design in this city. So I certainly have no issue with international architects being in the mix, if you like, in competitions. I think as a local architect, the one thing I'd like to see is that it actually was a level playing field. So Louise, you mentioned you have 1 local architect, 5 international in your competition, so 16% of local and the rest is international. One of the things I've been saying for a long time is I think 50% minimum local architects is a fair and level playing field. I don't know about other architects, but I have no issue competing with international architects. And I think, like any competition, may the best architect win. When you see a winning entry and you concur that's the best entry, I think you can only be happy for the proponent, but I think I'd like to see for Sydney architects 50% local, and by 50% I mean 50% in the lead design role. With due respect to architects who partner, that's fine as a decision, but I don't see that as a full place. Really, what that says to the local industry is you're not good enough to design, the international architect designs, and you're a delivery architect because you're local. So I'm saying 50% in a lead design role.
Yeah, I'm inclined to agree with that as someone who's not a direct beneficiary of that outcome. But I also find, and this is my own observation as a juror, I could be the fifth member on the panel here. Often the local architects have a much more, not necessarily bespoke, but a fine-tuned understanding of place, which is not always the case when an international architect participates. Not always, but there is a sort of a gap.
Can I be inclined to disagree then?
Yeah.
In the sense that I prefer not a quota, because most, I guess, developers and clients I work with, it does depend on the competition, it is a bit horses for courses, but there's a real recognition in the industry that supporting Australian architects, the calibre of talent we have here. So in some respects, it probably doesn't even take a quota for that to happen, in at least the ones I've been involved in. So I think the moment you add another number in that I've got to comply with, it could be tough, and it could not be as flexible for those reasons. But from my perspective, the industry's backing you.
Right.
Yeah.
What do you think from a developer's point of view?
I probably wouldn't support the quota. I think it's best firms for the opportunity. And in the case of the one I'm talking about, that was a global search. We knew we had a unique site. We knew we had a site with challenges as well. And we were looking for firms that we thought could deliver a different product there, meeting those challenges. Another criteria for us was, could we work with them? So we were very clear and in our discussions with Graham about a relationship that we could have. And we saw it in the competition when we had some firms were also very clear we didn't want to see another building that looked like a building in Sydney. And there was one person on that jury that I think we debated with Graham to say that they've done another building close by. We're not as keen. What they produced was one of the offshores. What they produced was something that looked very similar to that building. But I think then the jury, we all agreed they were knocked out pretty quickly because of that. They hadn't met the criteria. But as the person or the proponent that then has to work with that firm for the next 5, 6, 7 years, we also had criteria around the type of people they were. And you saw firms roll in, particularly some of the really big names, architects, with 5 or 6 people. 5 of them sat on the side and 1 presented. That didn't read well for us as being the proponent, because we knew there was a whole team we were going to work with for the next 5 years or decade. In the case of 3XN, it was a firm that Kim Nielsen, the principal, was presenting. He made a mistake on something. One of his own team said, "Oh, Kim, it's actually this." And he said, "Oh, you're right. Why don't you come up and talk about that?" That ticked the box for us. And I remember Bridget and others saying the same. So there's a lack of ego, and that's important when you're the client for several years to come.
Helen, I think to me there's 2 quite Australian attitudes informing this. I think there's the tall poppy syndrome, and I do think developers have a sense that if we're getting it from overseas, it's better, and I think there's an Australian attitude about that, or that we can perhaps market an overseas architect. So I think that's what's leading to having more internationals on competitions. And I guess my quota, if you like, comes from another Australian attitude, which is the notion of a fair go. And I think a fair go, I come out at 50%. I accept you don't want another number, Claire, I fully support that. If you want to replace it with a fair go, that's fine. And I'll go on the record, 16% is not a fair go.
Yeah. But the thing about the nuance of understanding the local system actually is really important. And I'd be interested to even hear from Louise, like, sometimes when you're considering which architect should win, like, I know often they have local partners, but sometimes you actually have to run down to City Hall and have a meeting. And it's easier to get Vivian to run down with you than it is to fly someone up from Denmark. So
it's another part of the criteria.
Yeah.
It's how you as a proponent or client, part of our criteria was they had to establish a practice initially with a local firm. In that case, they partnered with Vivian and have continued to do that. And they had to have a presence in Australia. We had to get PI out of them in Australia, where they had to have a local office. So it's what you as the client demand, if you like, and that was part of it. I take your point, Philip. I think as a proponent, though, what you're looking for and whether it comes out of an Australian architectural practice or offshore, we have to go and see products that we think are going to make it. That's doable, that's leasable, that's a point of difference, particularly for the major buildings on the skyline. You're competing with, and in this case in Sydney at the moment and Melbourne, with the amount of development that's occurring, you're competing with 3 or 4 others, and these are, the end value of Key Quarter is 1.5 billion, so it sort of blows your stat out of the water, Rob, I think on the 7.3 billion that have gone under competition. So that's a big investment, and you look for products, whether it's in Australia or offshore, that you think that's going to meet the brief. They get it, they know how to do it.
I've never seen an international architect deal with SEP 65 as well as Australian architects do. And don't throw Inga Hoven at me.
That, by the way, is probably a barrier to entry.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Graham, I wasn't going to come to you till just now, but till the end. But have you thought about that thing of the fair go and the representations of both parties? I mean, obviously it's a commercial undertaking of huge magnitude in terms of financial risk, but in terms of supporting the professions and supporting Australian talent, have you thought about that from a policy point of view of mandating quotas, so to speak?
Well, definitely I want to support great outcomes. Really variable, challenging, interesting, curious, craftful outcomes. That's the thing. We've got to rebuild the city. We've come so much from behind the 8 ball. We had a culture, we had some great government architects over the Victorian period, and then we had ultimately a culture which really paid no regard to the quality of the built environment. They're just so happy that we got blue skies and a harbour and some beaches. So given that lack of cultural interest and cultural support for the actual built quality of the cities, I think that we've got to focus on driving very well considered outcomes. And of course our 6.21, the famous clause in our LEP, which lists all the kinds of considerations that you need to put your mind to, really covers the breadth of issues. If along the way we can support the dynamic and creative ability of Australian, not saying Australian born even, but Australian domicile architects, that is a great outcome too. And part of that is building the capacity and experience of those local architects to the point where we did see some architects slam dunk over 5 or 4 internationals and win hands down. One of them is here tonight. And that was a moment which, with that high profile project, that we kind of built on, and it is moving kind of forward, that there is recognition now that they've got the capacity, the design experience, and the sort of future offerings, as well as knowing that there are a whole other global network to choose from. So I'm not finding it so. Like from your perspective, I think it's improving. But in Louise's case, this is the premio example.
Yeah, it's probably not the typical
of all the number of competitions, this is the number one in terms of value and profile, postcard view. Most of the competitions sit somewhere else. And some of the best work has been done by the Australian architects, given the opportunity by their clients, by their proponents.
Yeah. I'll come back to you again, Philip. Well, another issue is, this thing about fees, and architects are their own worst enemy in some respects, in terms of doing whatever's required to win the job. But do you think that the fees for competitions, and you can probably only speak from your own experience, are commensurate with the effort and time that has been put into it? And I know it's not just an architectural issue, there's other consultants who are involved. And what do you think might be a response to that in terms of how to make it more fair, the fair go, as you talked about?
Yeah. So Helen, I think you're right, I can really speak from my point of view, but I probably need to speak from all architects' point of view. There is a sense from some architects, I think it depends how you view competitions. So if you view it as a form of work and your payment as a form of income, then I think you are underpaid by a factor of 3 to 5 times. And that there is that sector. I happen not to be part of that group, but that is a fair assessment. And I think Rob's book comes out at something like 3.4 something or other times your competition fee. If you see a competition fee as a form of paid procurement for work, then I think it's very fair. And certainly we as a practice aim for an earning ratio of what we call 1-to-1, so we cover our labour cost. No overheads, no profit. We sometimes don't achieve that if we get less than that, but we think it's very fair. And if you consider other procurement processes, like a detailed EOI followed by a request for tender for government, you can spend a lot of time and money in that form of procurement process as well. And certainly we would prefer to be spending our time and money being procuring through design rather than through tendering for our cost.
Paperwork.
Correct, and costs and just driving down fees. If you go a step further, if you actually see competitions as a form of paid design research, then it's fantastic for architects. So and I think we sit between the last two and are very happy with the amount that's paid. You then mentioned we're our own worst enemy. Look, I think there's two things that are happening. One, I think there is an inordinate amount of detail that's being required. I think too much resolution, and yes, architects are probably providing too much. I did hear of a design report the other day of over 500 pages. So I think if we could limit the page limit and perhaps limit the amount of technical assessment, and so get it back to focus on design primarily, and have faith that between clients, consultants, architects, that we can resolve buildings as a design develops towards the stage 2, I think that would be better. So I would encourage a page limit. We just finished a competition, I think it was January, had a 24-page limit, was quite sufficient for us to explain the design, although there was no limit on the appendices. So, so I can tell you 24 pages was fine as an architect, and then you had appendices up to 100, 200 pages. Yeah. So I don't think that quite worked, but I think some kind of tradition where you limit the pages would be a helpful way for architects to contain themselves.
Or even a weight limit, as someone who's been a juror and had to kind of
I think you'd see very thin paper all of a sudden.
I mean, the other thing in terms of reputation and competitiveness and profile, I mean, there are many award winners out of the design excellence competitions, and of course architects are the beneficiaries of those awards. Do you think that in terms of winning a design competition, it directly connects to building your reputation and profile in a more competitive way? And
yes, I think so.
Yep. Okay.
But I'd be interested in Clare's opinion. I guess she's sort of looking at design reputations of architects who are winning and not. So my suspicion is yes. Clare?
It's a bit of both. I think sometimes you can be top of mind, and therefore top of mind gets you the next project, but also people want variety. So.
How often do your clients, I mean, obviously in someone who's convening a process with the city and managing it, how often do the clients ask you about your recommendations?
Yeah, quite frequently, but it is collaborative because as you'll see in the book how certain clients will actually fly around the world to see every single architect that they're shortlisting. So I think there's obviously a firm understanding throughout a lot of the organisations which are running the competitions, at least in the CBD, of which architects they do know of or like working with or have respect for. I guess there can be questions about who has won recent ones or who has been on ones or who has a lot of work on, who doesn't have a lot, who's up and coming. So I guess just from exposure in the industry, you will be asked that question, but you're also dealing with a very educated clientele as well. So,
well, you have experience on quite a number of competitions, both in the city centre and at Parramatta, and talking to Rob's point earlier about the sort of the ripple effect of actually influencing processes in other jurisdictions, in the other second cities, so to speak, and in terms of state government projects. Do you see a sort of a level A competition, sort of B competition, sort of trying to wannabe competition sort of process, or do you think that the city has created a standard which is very much
it's very
the benchmark
sophisticated, very professional. I think what's interesting though is where it's not a mandatory requirement, people are choosing to do it as well. So there must be something in it that's attractive from a developer point of view. So we work
in the city or out of the city. What about in Parramatta?
So Parramatta is mandatory in the CBD.
Yeah.
But for example, we worked on the Channel 9 site in Willoughby and Croffy 1 because the client decided to go back and do a competition. Even 2 Morton Street in Parramatta, which is a residential building outside of the CBD. Fraser's decided, well, we're going to do an informal competition. So there must be benefit if you're choosing to do something that's not mandatory as well.
So, I mean, to Rob's point, he talked about some of the concerns of people he interviewed was red tape, prolongation of processes. I mean, I would have thought that the point of doing a design competition was to actually streamline that process and have more certainty. So what is your experience, do you think?
So I would say by and large, I guess it's seen as a condition of entry in those jurisdictions where it is mandatory. So I think there's just an acceptance and an understanding that you have to do it. There may be some grumblings at the beginning about whether it's mandatory or the time or the process, but by and large, even I think across time less grumblings because of the sophistication of the process and the acceptance of it, but by and large, even people who had grumblings end up being convinced with the design that is put in place for them. Red tape, sometimes clients comment on, well, why can't I go to competition straight away? Why do I have to do a stage 1 DA? So let me explore the rules and explore council's DCP straight in a competition. That might be one that is commented on quite a lot, but in terms of the actual competitive process, there seems to be I've sort of grown up under the curve of the timeline. There seems to be this acceptance in the industry that you do it, and then even ones who are vaguely negative about it are convinced by, I haven't seen an unhappy marriage, which is also commented on in the book. Maybe they don't tell me, but I haven't seen it.
That's pretty good, isn't it?
Not bad.
As a planner, wearing a different hat, you're involved in a lot of planning approval processes and public scrutiny, public participation, consultation, transparency of that process is inherent in that. This is actually a very much behind closed doors process. How do you think it compares in terms of balancing the public interest and the private interest and managing an efficient and effective process?
I read the pros and cons in the book, and I tended to agree with it doesn't have to have full public transparency because it's a procurement process of sorts. I think developers, and I can't speak on behalf of everyone, but I think there would be an openness to, for example, AMP, you put yours in your lobby, all the entries, so there was an openness to that. You'll find that the Council of Tall Buildings is the only forum which actually has a debrief on competitions, and whenever we approach developers on that basis, they're quite happy to be involved. I think in some respects they probably wouldn't mind if the Design Competition Alternatives Report was an appendix to the Stage 2 DA. I don't think that would be controversial, but I'm happy to have the room throw things at me. So the reasons not to make it full swathe public, I think I agreed with in terms of the premise in the book, but there might be ways where that debrief, and actually really good clients and really good developers hold their own debriefings with, I know that's not public, but they hold their own debriefings with the architects as well. But maybe there is mechanisms where the public can peer in and see, for example, like AMP did, where they were quite transparent about all the entries that went into the competition.
Okay.
I've got to say, the competition we finished this year, there was a full debrief, and there's not always a full debrief. And without a full debrief where you can look at everyone's entry, you start to get conspiracy theories, what happened, what went on in the jury, and when there's a full debrief, it feels better from a competitor's point of view at least. But I also can't see why, given that the amount of work that's done, it can't be put up in town hall or something and displayed.
So, Graham, good segue there. Have you ever considered that, or do you think it's just better to just sort of move on once a decision has been made to enable that process to be expedited?
Yep. So we originally proposed that Customs House, when it was refitted in the 90s, has a floor with a competition in display. No one came.
Oh.
There is no...
When?
Sorry, 90s.
Yeah, that's quite a long time ago now,
Yeah.
I suppose.
We imagine there's a lot of interest, but in fact, broadly, there isn't. We've got people from the industry here tonight, but we're talking about the public. But it will change, and it already has changed because they're starting to see and experience the products that have come out of the process. And there's some other discussions occurring in the media, in the print media and the online media, around buildings and projects and lists, and have you seen this and you've been to that? What's really turning them on is the kind of, operations that are occurring within these buildings. Food and restaurants and bars and food, and they're just starting to see the whole character enabling process around those projects. So I think it will pass, just like all things, to a point where there'll be sufficient interest to set aside a valuable space to exhibit projects. But I think before we get to that point, there might be an online opportunity. So there's always development. It's just a question of how much public money do you put into it versus how much public effort do you try to put into getting better outcomes.
Yeah. Okay. Now, final questions for Graham. Now, it goes without saying that it's raised the bar. The competition process has been very successful in raising the bar of the design of the built environment in the City of Sydney. There's also been extraordinary number of public benefits in terms of high quality public domain, public art, placemaking, as you've talked about, in terms of activation, and ecosystems being developed in terms of place. Is that public benefit commensurate to the commercial benefit that is being accrued to the developers? I mean, I'm not quite sure what the commercial development would be. I'm sure it's in a bottom drawer somewhere for AMP. But are you actually giving away more than we're actually getting in terms of public benefit to the larger community?
Okay, so you're talking about the 10% height and floor space? Height or floor space?
For example, could it be used for housing or other benefits over and above what's already being in the LEP?
It's been a very successful incentive to, on average, offer up to 10% of height or floor space. It's up to. So some projects have only had 3 or 4%, some 6.5%. Mostly they've got to 9 or 10 because by increasing the floor space or height, there hasn't been any material harm to another place that's been assessed. So firstly, the percentage is variable. Secondly, it's an averaging. So I know Singapore has 112 contribution districts. I mean, just talk about how much a development pays for the right to be developed, right? So that's just recognising the land values in Singapore. being so different. That kind of complexity is never going to work. And what actually I think helped to make it work is it was a simple up to 10%. And it has an averaging. So the very, very big developments with great foreshore and views, it probably was worth a lot, but there was a lot involved and a lot of complexity and running costs and so on. But the smaller projects, the 10% probably isn't that much. But I think we have to just learn from the 20-year history that this process has been and understand that that simple formula, simple message, on average works.
Okay. So, and it's probably been resilient because it's maintained its longevity. So in terms of longevity, where to from here? Because it has had a number of iterations, and so things can evolve. We talked about exhibitions. We talked about what do you see as the next evolution of the design excellence process?
I think broadly, you should only introduce a competitive design requirement where you've got the governance, the council, fully committed. You've got the processes fully resourced. You've got the design panels very capable. You've got a consent authority like the CSPC, which was a joint partnership between the state and the city. Again, that's another partnership. But what I'm pointing out is you need all those gates lined up because you're putting in resource at the beginning and you're going to get a product out the end. And they all rely on all of those being in place. If you start to say from, the next thing is that every council should do competitions, I'm saying be careful. Because unless you've got that quality of juror, that design advisory panel, that commitment from council, the planning instruments written in such a way, the competition policy and the resource to observe those competitions and maintain probity, then it becomes a riskier venture. So I'm just saying, go there if you can satisfy all those requirements.
No, I wasn't thinking about what you're recommending for others. I was thinking about reflection. Like you go, well, we've been doing this for a certain period, and we know that this is still working and it's not broken, and we're not going to and we don't need to fix it. Yeah. Or is there any iteration that you see? Obviously, global competitiveness has been demonstrated. Good governance has been demonstrated. Public policy has been demonstrated. Where do you think there's any iteration at this point?
I'm just talking about megatrends. So I think broadly there's a convergence on cities, and job density is increasing even more quickly than residential densities. There is an expectation of stewardship, so co-sharing, and I think the process almost anticipated that 20 years ago. But the idea is that we don't have a majority on the jury. We don't even have a majority on the CSPC. But the fact is it's kind of approached as a genuine partnership. And there's a trust there, and it doesn't always work out because there's a huge spectrum of developers, capacity and enlightenment, down to just in it for the money, boots and all, concreter, And the process has to deal with that completely broad spectrum. So anyway, I'll go back to the point. The stewardship of the city is the challenge. We've got a very significantly changing environment. We've got a changing generation with changing expectations. And we do have to be much more nuanced in the way big buildings, for example, serve many different purposes. Briefs around those uses need to become intelligent. And that's where I think the next challenge is.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. Yeah. All right, well, I know there's probably some questions from the audience, and so there is a microphone available, I think. And so does anyone have a question that they'd like to pose to the panel?
Ken.
Thank you. Thanks to the panel. Firstly, just a comment, I guess, Philip, and then a question, please. The assumption around a fair go and the quantity of, or the role of Australian architects with international, it seemed to be embedded in that the local architect was a supporter rather than an equal partner in design. So I would just make that observation that in my experience we've insisted on being equal or not at all, and we found that very rewarding and very educational for us. But the question, it was alluded to a moment ago, why don't we start competitions before the Stage 1 DA? Because we often inherit a Stage 1 DA, and the biggest trick for us in competitions is knowing if there's appetite to break that rule or not. And it's a big gamble that we all take, and even in the interim review, it's never clear because people are on record of what they can and can't say. So we go to the interim review for advice with ideas around busting a Stage 1 DA. People are nodding, it all looks cool, but then they say, no, don't break it. And it's tricky.
That's a really good question, and in fact it was probably one that was probably on the list of ones to ask, and Graham and probably Louise, you might both be able to answer that. I mean, I suppose it's about certainty and transparency in terms of the public realm, but I mean, can you, both of you or either of you, respond to that?
I think even for the developer, it's probably stepping through stages of certainty. There are big costs being outlaid. In the case of a building you currently have tenanted, you're making decisions around timeframes of what that's going to look like. So I guess what we try and do is, you start the process with this amount of risks and you're trying to bring it down like that as you're spending more money too. So I think, the logic of the way it's set out at the moment probably equates to that as well, that you're trying to, okay, we've got the envelope, we broadly know what we can do. I would say, in the processes that I've been involved with, Graham, we've still challenged the rules later on, and it comes, and we did it on that competition. There was one entry that was challenging the rules big time, and we all agreed we should look at that, not die wondering. And that was done, and then both the authority and the proponent said, just can't solve it, it's too big. So I think you've still got to be prepared to challenge the rules, but I think for the developer it is about the certainty.
I might just actually park it with that response, because we've only got time for one more question, because I'm being told to wrap up. So was there one more question? I saw someone had a question. Have they gone? They disappeared? Oh, James. So it's just one quick question. Meaning it has to end in a question.
I've really got a very long comment. No. I've been very privileged to be on juries for quite a number of competitions, and I think that we must really search for ways to increase the transparency. And there was an amazing experience at Sydney University when they ran their Campus 2010 competitions way back, and there in that community where the community was concerned about its future, the jurors all presented, the competitors all presented publicly in what was that very fine Stephen Roberts Theatre. So I think there's actually a possibility for developers to to have courage and to open it up to that extent. And I think the way that day unfolded really engaged the university community in a big way on the future of their campus. So I'm just wondering if you'd make the very radical step of having the developers, the architects themselves be present while I think they weren't allowed to be present while the others were presenting. But certainly the university people were able to be part of it. How about making it that open?
I think when it's public money, a public project, and a university is that, there's certainly a strong case for public interest. Yeah. When we've come a long way with commercial proponents, opening up their procurement systems to take a lot more matters into consideration than they otherwise would have. And there's nothing stopping or preventing any one of those proponents doing exactly what you say under the current rules, right? So there's got to be a driver there. Maybe there'll become a driver but I can see how the public money, public building is a good driver in your example.
I'll tell you what it would do, James. It'd end the two-stage competitions. There wouldn't ever be a short list of two and a second stage.
In what way? Sorry.
Well, so everyone's been public, so there's common knowledge of what everyone's design is. So it really stops that second stage because you know what you're competing against.
Yes, that's right.
I do want to thank our presenter, Rob Freestone, and also his colleagues who undertook this research. I also want to thank our panellists, and I know you want to join me in thanking them for their contributions for this lovely discussion tonight. And so if you can all join me in a round of applause. I do have to do a quick plug for CTBUH. There's a big conference coming up in October in Chicago. So for those of you who are members, I thoroughly recommend it. It's 50 years forward and 50 back. And it should be a pretty interesting conference on the past and the future of tall buildings globally. But also, we have our own upcoming events, and this is just one of our ones focused on Sydney and the city, but we also have our international speaker series, and our next one is Walter Hood coming up on the 14th of May, followed by Francine Hubin, Dutch architect, on the 27th of May. So if you have an appetite, please join us for any of those events.